Hello, everyone. Welcome to the webinar Bird Safety on Farms. I'm Joanne Baumgartner with Wild Farm Alliance. We're happy to be able to talk about this topic today. We have helped growers put in habitat, put in nest boxes and vegetative habitat, and so they can benefit from pest control services and also just support these wonderful creatures. And though sometimes we have seen and we recognize that birds are not safe on farms, so we created this webinar and an associated publication to help address some of the issues that come up with bird safety. Um, let's see. I'm going to tell you our Zoom guidelines are that all participants will be muted. If you have technical issues, go to the chat. We'll give you some help, and also use the chat when you want to ask our presenters questions there. We'll take questions after or answer questions after each of the three presentations. A little bit about Wild Farm Alliance. We have this bold 2050 vision of 1 million nest boxes and perches in the US, of hedgerows to the moon and back, and restoring the lifeblood of the landscape. Today, we're going to have Hardy Kern, Director of Government Relations from the American Bird Conservancy, speak about pesticides that are most harmful to birds and pesticide policy. And myself, Joanne, will be talking about terminating cover crops and protecting ground nesting birds when doing that. And Breanna Martinico, Human Wildlife Interaction Advisor from UC Agricultural and Natural Resources, is going to be talking about impact of roads to nest box success. This is our new publication I referred to. You can go to wildfarmalliance.org/protectbirds to get it, or if you don't remember that, just go to our resources, you'll find it. And yeah, thanks to all our funders for that, for supporting that. I wanted to tell you that tomorrow is the start of a 10-part series of webinars on the role of birds in Midwest farms. It's going to be going for months, and you can also go to our website to find out more about that. This webinar has 1 CCA credit from American Society for Agronomy. And if you'd like to get that credit, stick around for the end to fill out the evaluation form, and you'll get the license, or you'll get the right information. We also are going to have a evaluation at the end. So please fill that out. It really helps us and our funders see how this information we're presenting is beneficial and how we can make it better in the future. Oops, I'm going to stop sharing. And our first speaker up is Hardy Kern with American Bird Conservancy.
Thank you so much, Joanne, and everyone, thank you so much for making time to join us today to talk about this super important topic. I'm going to start sharing my screen. So yeah, my name is Hardy Kern. I am Director of Government Relations for American Bird Conservancy's Pesticides and Birds campaign. And I promise you the title is not as interesting as it sounds, but I am very lucky to get to do the work that I do and so excited to talk a little bit about it today. And what I'm going to be covering is sort of a primer. We're going to go really wide, so hang in there with me, but it's going to be interesting, I promise, about the impacts of various pesticides on birds. So for starters, I want to talk a little bit about who I'm here on behalf of. I'm so honored to be joining the Wild Farm Alliance for this webinar and of this wonderful researcher that we're going to hear from as well. I'm with a group called American Bird Conservancy, ABC, and our tagline is that we take bold actions for birds across the Americas. We are an international nonprofit, but we have folks in 34 of the 50 states, primarily doing field research or conservation work on both public and private lands. And over on the right of my slide is this pyramid. This is basically our version of a mission statement. This is how we look at bird conservations. At the tippy top, we try to prevent bird extinction. So we try to address birds that are listed as threatened or endangered under the federal and state Endangered Species Acts. Underneath that, we try to reverse bird population declines. Under that, we try to reduce threats to all birds. And then at the very bottom is work kind of like this, which is building the bird conservation movement, getting more people aware of what's happening and what's going on. And where I fit is right here, reducing threats to all birds, which is not ambitious at all, right? This is the way that we try to address how it is that birds are threatened by a lot of different factors and what we can do to lower them. My job is primarily to look at how birds are impacted on a local, state, and national scale by pesticide use and what solutions can be offered to help reduce that. And when we talk about pesticides and birds and how they interact, there's some things that immediately come to mind, of course, birds that might be directly exposed to a poison, be sprayed by a poison, might eat a poison. But as I'll talk about, there's a lot of other cascading ways that it can happen. And luckily, there are things that we can do from an at-home level to an at the grocery store level to a federal policy level that can help lower these risks. So for a little bit of starters, this is a map that a lot of us are probably very familiar with. It's from the Cornell Lab of Ornithology, and it shows how barn swallows, a pretty common bird in agricultural spaces, moves throughout the country. And I like showing this because it gives us a better appreciation for what happens when birds are migrating. A lot of people hear birds migrate and they think, okay, when it's cold, they fly straight down to where it's warm and hang out. And when it's warm, they fly straight north and go up and make more little birds. But as you can see, migration is this really big kind of long process where birds are moving through a lot of different spaces. Just because their breeding grounds are in a specific area and their wintering grounds are on a specific reserve doesn't mean that they won't touch dozens of other spaces, if not hundreds of other spaces throughout the United States. That means every single opportunity that we can give them to be less exposed to toxic chemicals is something that will help them as they're migrating, is something that could help their children, is something that can ensure a safer future for birds. And I also show this map because unlike a lot of other species where they only live in this particular county or they're always found in a field, they're always found underground. Birds go everywhere. Birds have wings, which is great, but it means that there's a lot of different potential places where they could face different risk factors. And unfortunately, we're going to start off on a little bit of a bummer as well. There was a report released in 2019 that found that about 1 in 4 birds have disappeared from North American skies since 1970. And the group of birds that has been most harshly impacted are aerial insectivores. These are birds that are, or the second most impacted, I should say. But these are birds that are flying around and catching bugs out of the sky. So swallows and swifts and a lot of the birds that you might see hanging out in agricultural areas. But before we go into what's driving that decline, and we're going to talk about a big one today, which is, of course, pesticides, I thought it might be helpful to give a better understanding of what is meant by the word pesticide. This is the federal legal definition. A pesticide is any product that prevents, destroys, repels, or mitigates a pest. So that means anything that you would buy or apply to try to kill a pest or keep one from coming onto your farm field, into your backyard, whatever it might be, is a pesticide. That includes insecticides, rodenticides, herbicides, fungicides, avicides, all fall under this big umbrella. And I think that's important to know because I'm going to use the word pesticide a lot. We're going to hear it a lot today. And it's helpful to know that when we say that, we're not just referring to chemicals that kill bugs, we're referring to all of these different products. The best estimates that we have on bird mortality from pesticides in the United States is somewhere between 67 and 72 million birds per year. Now, if you're familiar with bird conservation, you might see that number and think, well, compared to window strikes, compared to outdoor cats, things like that, that number doesn't seem so high. But this is the best estimate we could get of bird deaths strictly from being directly exposed. That means that the bird, in pretty much a one off instance, was exposed to enough chemical to kill it. It does not account for a lot of other things, including what happens when we start chipping away at the places that birds need to live and the food sources that they need to survive. And of course, for birds, there's one food source that's really important, and that is bugs. I want everyone to take a guess as to what percent of all terrestrial birds in North America rely on insects. And you don't have to shout it out or anything. You can write in the chat or keep it in your head. 96%. 96% of all terrestrial birds in the US need insects at some point in their lifetime. And this goes beyond birds like this beautiful water thrush that we think of as bug eaters. This goes into hummingbirds, which primarily feed their babies spiders. This goes into chickadees, which primarily feed their young caterpillars. Even the birds that we think of as just seed-eating backyard feeder birds pretty much always rely on insects. And in fact, Doug Tallamy and Greg Schreiber took that 2019 data that showed all these birds in decline, and they said, well, let's try to figure out if there's any larger correlations besides just these really big groups. So they looked at what are primary bird food resources. And when they did that, they found that for bird species for which insects were an essential part of their life, an essential part of their diet, those were the species that were in decline. For bird species where insects were not a major part of their diet, so fish eating birds, scavenging birds, the very small portion that might only eat fruit, they were actually doing pretty okay. Their numbers were not seen in this big decline. And so, how do we get bird declines from pesticides? There's about five different categories that I put it into. Habitat loss, so chemicals being used, which leads to fewer places for birds to build nests and hunt and rear their young. Acute exposure, so this is when a bird is exposed to enough chemical for it to be lethal in one dose. Prey loss is probably the most impactful one. So the use of chemicals, which leads to fewer insects, fewer wild fruits being produced, fewer grasses being produced, things like that. Acute exposure that has sublethal impacts. So maybe the bird didn't get exposed to enough chemical for it to be deadly, but it might have gotten exposed to enough chemical to where it can't fly or it cannot keep weight on and therefore it cannot migrate, or there's not enough poison in there for it to, like I said, die, but there might be enough poison to prevent its organs from functioning properly. So that can lead to death, but it doesn't fall into that neat, clean category of death from pesticides that's been reported. And then unfortunately, we also have chronic exposure. This is what happens when birds get exposed to a little bit of chemical very regularly over a long period of time. And we don't have a great idea of what happens in that case. It is being studied, but we can guess it probably isn't great. The biggest thing that I want to drive home from my talk is that fewer bugs means less food for birds. When we have a lot of chemicals being used in the environment, a lot of chemicals being used in agriculture, it leads to less bugs, which means less food for birds. When there are not enough bugs, they might turn to less than optimal diets, including sown seeds on farms, which might themselves be coated in chemicals. It might mean that they have to fly further, expand more energy when they're out looking for food. And it also means that they're away from their nest, they're away from shelter longer, which increases their risk of predation, both from native and non native predators. So we'll start with a really broad, I'm going to go through like three very broad classes of commonly used pesticides in agriculture. And I know I'm going at the speed of light, so I appreciate everyone hanging in there. We'll start with insecticides. So these are chemicals that kill bugs. There are three broad types. Systemic insecticides, which are actually grown into a plant as it's developing, making the entire plant toxic, not just the chemical that might be coated onto it. There is contact insecticides, which are things that are applied directly. Typically, this is sprayed out of a backpack, drenched into soil, or dropped out of an airplane. And then there are ingested insecticides, things that are meant to be eaten by a bug and therefore become, toxic to them that way. One big class that we hear a lot right now that I spend a lot of time working on, so I wanted to give it a little extra attention, is a group called neonicotinoids. When you start working on pesticides, you get really good at Scrabble because the names are ridiculous. So neonicotinoid just means a new nicotine-like insecticide. They're called neonic for short. They're nicotine-like in that they actually are a nicotine derivative. They act on the same sensors inside of a bug's body that nicotinic receptors act in. Basically, when a bug ingests a neonic, it causes their nerves to fire constantly, which leads to convulsions, organ failure, all sorts of things, and ultimately death. The downside is they do the same thing in higher level organisms like birds. When they eat enough of a neonic or they have enough of it applied to them on accident, they will start to experience those same effects. Neonicotinoids are very commonly coated on the outside of seeds, particularly in large monoculture crops, as well as large row crops, which California certainly has a lot of. The trick, though, is when a neonic is applied to a seed, they're systemic, so they're of that class that is supposed to get grown up into the plant, but they're also very water soluble. That's their whole trick, is that they come off easily with water so that the plant can then suck them up. But that also means that when you plant them in the ground and you water them, like you do with a seed, most of the chemical actually washes off into the soil and then gets into groundwater, or the seeds themselves can be eaten by birds, which leads to a lot of really negative consequences. But fundamentally, it means that only about somewhere between 3 and 5% of the chemical that is coated on the outside of a seed actually makes it into the plant to start fighting insect pests. 95 to 97% of it goes elsewhere into the environment. And when birds eat and interact with neonics, there is a litany of different negative impacts that they feel. Everything from weight loss to loss of motor control, inability to migrate, inability to navigate, fewer insects for them to eat, and then, of course, death, unfortunately. So, we smiling yet? We having fun? Next up, I want to talk a bit about herbicides. And there are a lot of different types of herbicides. Herbicides are chemicals that are formulated to kill plants. So these are used primarily on weeds, especially in large agricultural settings or in your backyards as well. And the way that herbicides are formulated are very, very different from insecticides. They operate on cell systems and on enzyme receptors that frankly aren't usually present in vertebrates or invertebrate animals. However, that doesn't mean that they can't impact them. And why this is important to point out is that when the Environmental Protection Agency or the California Department of Pesticide Regulation are registering a new chemical, they look at the laboratory tests for we exposed an organism directly to these chemicals and we're looking to see if there's a result. With birds, we do see negative results from a lot of insecticides, but the herbicides themselves are not as toxic to birds on their own. However, there has been a lot of work done to check this out and see if it's true. Of course, number one, there's the issue of fewer or lower crop diversity or lower plant diversity, which leads to lower insect diversity. So that's already a problem for birds. But I'm going to go kind of in ascending order of craziness of these results. There's a study that basically found that when herbicides were heavily used, It led to reduced habitat for birds around farm areas, which led to reduced breeding and lower populations. There was a study found that when herbicides were used in adjacent areas, there were fewer non-crop plants, which meant fewer insects because plant diversity leads to insect diversity, leads to all the biodiversity. Another study found that when there were fewer weeds, so fewer, non-desirable plants in and around agricultural areas, and I'm not saying weeds to particularly pick on a plant, I'm just saying this is what they're called in the literature. Fewer weeds meant that there were fewer seeds produced out in the environment. And for early migratory birds, a lot of the seeds that they rely on when they're first coming, or a lot of the food that they rely on when they first come north, are seeds because it's not warm enough for the bugs to have come back yet in big numbers. So early migratory birds weren't getting enough food because there wasn't enough weeds producing seeds when there was a lot of herbicide use. And then here's the one that's a real, it's a long chain, but it does work out. This is all peer-reviewed literature. Native plant depletion from herbicide use led to native insect depletion, which led to birds feeding on suboptimal food sources, so things that are not as nutritious as bugs, which overall led to fewer babies. And then the last group that I'm going to touch on of chemicals is rodenticides. There are two basic types of rodenticides. So these are chemicals that are meant to kill mice and rats and other rodent vermin. Again, industry term, not reflecting my personal views. There are anticoagulant rodenticides, which are chemicals that are meant to prevent the clotting of blood in the prey or in the victim rather in the target organism. Unfortunately, same thing happens in non-target organisms like pets and hawks and owls and things. And then there are chemicals that work in other methods as well. There are two different types of anticoagulant. First generation, which are chemicals that usually require at least two, three, maybe four exposures in a mouse or a rat before they're deadly. So it doesn't kill them right away, but it still prevents blood clotting, which leads to organ failure. And then there's the second generation or SCARs that you might have heard, which are usually just a single feeding event can result in death of the target organism, but they're very highly toxic. And California actually has done a really great job of restricting the use of most of these to just licensed professionals. And then there are other methods, including neurotoxins, stomach gas poisoning, rodenticides, and ones that cause excessive calcium buildup. So there's a few different types of rodenticides that we see a lot in agriculture, and these impact the predatory birds. So maybe not the birds that eat other vertebrates more often, I guess is the better way to say it. So that's everything from California condors to owls to hawks and mice, or to hawks and kestrels rather, that eat mice, and oddly enough, even woodpeckers, which can themselves be scavengers from time to time. And what's important to know about this is these predatory birds are looking for the mouse or the rat or the rabbit or the vole that's moving more slowly, that's easier to catch, right? Those are the ones that are going to fall prey. And if your organs are shutting down because you've been exposed to a rodenticide, you're probably going to move a little slower, and it's more likely that you're going to be caught. California has some really excellent laws in place. There's hopefully more on the way that we're working on from an advocacy standpoint. That's a lot of what I do. You have a fabulous Department of Pesticide Regulation in California. It's actually the only state level Department of Pesticide Regulation that the federal government regularly relies on, which is great. California has already prohibited the use of all neonic insecticides on state-owned lands, so wildlife management areas and parks cannot use neonics, which is great. They require that all seeds sold in the state of California have all of their contents or their coding contents disclosed to the end user. It's the only state in the country that has that. And you're also working on reauthorizing the California Migratory Bird Treaty Act. This would enshrine all federal protections for birds at the state level in California. Now, the last part of what I'm going to talk about is this can all seem a little overwhelming and scientific and complicated, and Maybe you're not a farmer, maybe you're not a pest professional, maybe you are, and that's fabulous. But you might be asking, what is it that I can do to help start to lower the risk to birds? And the first thing that I will say, whether you are a farmer, whether you are a person that volunteers in a garden, whether you are anyone that has a home where you might need to control pests from time to time. I'm not saying never use chemicals. There are certainly situations that call for them when the time is absolutely needed, usually in response to a pest outbreak, where there's maybe a disease vector or something else at play. But no matter what you're using, always read the label. This is very rarely done by people. So the National Pesticide Information Center has this fabulous guide that they came up with that helps demystify what's on a bottle. Sometimes chemicals can't be applied during certain times of the day or near weather events like rainstorms because it increases the risk to non-target organisms. And usually you can lower the risk from some chemicals just by following the label rather than going out and spraying willy-nilly like a lot of us are prone to do. So that's my number one suggestion. I'm not going to spend a lot of time here since I don't want to eat up everyone else's time, but all the slides will be made available. This is just me saying try to get away from using the conventional chemicals as much as possible. There are non synthetic chemical alternatives that can be very effective when they're used well. And really, the number one thing that you can do if you are a non-grower, non-farmer is to support bird-friendly agriculture. So look for operations that are organic, especially if they're regenerative. That's wonderful. Wild Farm Alliance does a fabulous job of promoting these farms, telling their stories, providing them with resources. So check out their website. Shop local as often as you can. Even if they are a conventional farm, which isn't, as desirable, they usually have a better idea of what chemicals that they're using, so you can ask informed questions. And then support farms that practice integrated pest management, which I know is going to come up more later, so I'm not going to go into it. But I will also say, Joanne gave us a preview of this. This resource that Wild Farm Alliance has created, protecting birds and agricultural landscapes, is absolutely phenomenal. Whether you are someone like me that's not a farmer, or if you're a professional crop producer, there are four basic parts to it: pesticide dangers to birds that walk you through a lot of commonly used chemicals and how risky to birds they are. Bird safe approaches to cover crop termination, which I know we're going to talk a lot more about. Nest boxes and roads, where to put a nest box. And then also, they show their work. This is not just somebody, making things up. Everything is cited from here to Tuesday, and it's a really great free resource that I was very happy to play a very, very small part and help getting off the ground here. So there are parts for organic chemicals, conventional chemicals that are often used, and then those other two sections, which I know we're going to hear a lot more about in a minute. It's very user friendly. It makes a lot of sense and it completely demystifies all the chemicals that are used in large scale agriculture and helps us make better bird safe decisions. Birds are also themselves really great pest control. If you are able to provide kind of healthy, safe places for birds to live near your agricultural operation, whether you're a vineyard, putting up hawk perches can help. Whether you are a berry or fruit producer, making healthy migratory songbird habitat, they'll come in and eat your bugs for you. So there's a lot of ways to work with nature. And because I'm an advocacy professional, talk to your representatives. Let them know that this is something that's important to you. They can only make decisions based on what their constituents tell them. So whether it's your town council, whether it's your county commissioners, whether it's your state representatives or your federal representatives, let them know that lowering the risk of pesticides to birds is something that matters to you and something that you want to see them working on. And that's something that American Bird Conservancy can help a lot with. And the last thing I'll say before I turn it over to the real professionals is every action and every acre counts. There's not an action that's too small. There's not an amount of land that you can make chemical free that won't make a difference. It all helps because, like we saw from those barn swallows, birds are everywhere. They go everywhere. They need every inch they can get their wings on, and we're here to help them. So thank you very much. And don't worry, we've got a little bit of time for questions, I think.
Thanks, Hardy. Wow, that was fantastic. I was taking a bunch of notes and I knew it was going to be good, but
It was a lot. I apologize,
it
everyone.
was great. Um, yeah, Shelly just posted a note saying, does anybody have questions for Hardy?
Thank you for all the positive feedback. I'm seeing all the floaty hands and the thumbs up.
Um, yeah, lots of people loved
Oh
it.
yeah. So one question I'll lead off with that I get a lot for kind of the at-home use of pesticides is, okay, well then should I not use chemicals inside or outside? That's something that, does come up a lot for homeowners. The big answer to that I can give is I'm not advocating for anyone to, allow cockroaches or rats or anything to run around inside of where you're living, but try to, read the label. It'll tell you exactly how to use chemicals indoors to keep them from going outside and potentially affecting, outside wildlife. So that's something that's really important. Oh, can I expand on bird perches in berry fields? Yes, yes, I can. This is one of my favorite things. Thank you so much, California Marine Sanctuary Foundation. So, in vineyards, in berry fields, particularly in California, there are problems with rodents coming in. Usually, it's rats coming up to steal the fruit off the vine. Also, in California, there is a lot of cannabis production all up and down the West Coast. And for some reason, I'm sure someone does, I don't know exactly why. Cannabis fields, too, tend to be very, very good habitat for a lot of rodents to come in, and there could be some crop loss to them. So it's pretty common to see a lot of poison bait used to try to keep rodent populations down. However, there are organic and regenerative farms that have replaced rodent bait with those really tall, skinny tea perches that provide hawks and kestrels and eagles somewhere to sit during the day where they can sit up there to wait for rodents to come out so that they can hunt. And the best part is they do double duty because at nighttime they provide somewhere for owls to sit and hunt as well. And at scale, it has been very beneficial in a lot of vineyards and in some berry farms where they've provided more raptor habitat, and that has helped to naturally control rodent population. So that's beneficial. With the berry fields, I know we're going to get into that in a little bit here too, but I'll say that there have been studies looking at providing at least some native plant habitat, some migratory songbird habitat adjacent to large fruit farms. There's a lot of work that's been done by a researcher. His last name is Gonthier, Gonthier, looking at providing birds places to sit and perch next to fruit producing fields and helping keep pest pressures down that way, which is really, really great. Yeah. Do I recommend against installing owl boxes in farms with rodenticide use? That is an excellent question. I would generally say that you need to look at how much and where the rodenticides are being used. I would say that I would move away from using the anticoagulant rodenticides. They tend to be the most harmful to vertebrate wildlife. So there are ways to kind of double up. There's a product on the market that is called Rat X, just RATX. And the way that it works is it basically tricks a rodent's um, digestive system into thinking that it is saturated with water. So the rodents don't drink anything and then they pretty quickly dehydrate to death, which I'm sure is not pleasant for them. But it means that when they are in the process of dying or once they've actually passed, they are completely safe to be eaten by other wildlife. So you don't necessarily have to pick just a raptor habitat or poison. There are ways where you can pick different chemical control methods that are less harmful or not harmful to what we call non-target organisms or secondary consumers like owls and hawks and things like that. So really good question. But I would say if you're putting up owl boxes, I would at least avoid all anticoagulant rodenticides and try to switch over to mechanical methods like traps if possible. let's see. Is there a standard design on one of these perches? There are some available. I can provide a link afterwards, which is great, but generally you want them to be at least 10 inches long. They can be pretty skinny. Birds will, trees are all different sizes. Birds will perch anywhere. They can also be a small platform. That's totally fine too. And generally they want to be at least 10 feet up off the ground for a bird to feel safe. Anywhere between 10 and 20 is pretty standard. And I've got, in speaking with a berry grower last week, he was concerned about food safety risks associated with potential bird waste. Are those practices, are there practices to help mitigate those concerns? The way that I understand, great question. Thank you. The way that I understand it is if it is a purposefully introduced waste factor, something like if you were going to let chickens out or ducks out to remove pests from different fields, that can get a little complicated with whether or not it meets organic standards or food safety standards. However, if it is wildlife, and kind of incidental wildlife, if you will. As long as the produce is washed, there shouldn't really be an elevated risk. And that this actually has been looked at. They've, I believe, the majority of the literature has not found that if you attract birds, there might be more, fecal matter present, but it is not necessarily more dangerous than if it weren't there at all. If anything, the Department of Agriculture spends a lot of money incentivizing farmers to turn more of their habitat into productive land or not productive land, into conservation land, into natural spaces. So if anything, it's you're actually rewarded for bringing in more of the wildlife than anything else. So it is not yet considered a health risk. I do not see that changing at all either. As long as we're growing food outside, there's going to be wildlife there. That's very normal.
Could I just jump in? We've worked a lot
Please.
on food safety issues and conservation, and the best thing to do is not have a perch right next to your produce because the birds might poop as they're flying in or flying out, or mostly perching there, they might poop. So not that you can't have it near, I mean, they fly, so put it 10 feet away or 20 feet away or even further. And uh, however, you don't want it so far that they can't see well because they are perched there to find the pests. Yeah. It looks like you got another question. Um, Rodenticides are also having an impact on fishers. This paper focused on California.
Oh, yes.
But
Yeah, on fishers. And so the EPA is actually really trying hard to restrict anticoagulant rodenticides even more. They're getting a lot of pushback from pesticide industry because there are wildlife impacts, but the number one reported victims of accidental rodenticide poisoning are children and dogs and cats because they are so easily accessible, and mice and rats can be picked up off the street by pets, or children can get into supposedly tamper-proof containers. So it's a big problem for wildlife more than anything. That's where my main concern is. But of course, for anything that can get access to it, I mean, poison's poison.
yeah, and NRCS says they have some standards and designs for raptor perches and various nest boxes and can provide funding assistance to growers. So that is great. Um, let's see. How about if you take just one more question and then we'll move on.
Gladly. Yeah. So Jonathan said, have ABC thought about pushing for more government incentives regarding RNA pesticides? And that is a really interesting conversation that's happening right now. The answer is yes. We recently commented basically in support of exploring new options for pest control. The RNA angle, basically, this would be modifying pest DNA or creating a pesticide that would make small genetic modifications that would make it harder for them to breed or to feed or what have you, so that you're not getting that chemical impact. That's really interesting. We also work in Hawaii, actually, American Bird Conservancy does, helping to pilot mosquitoes that have been genetically engineered so that they are sterile, which means that they can enter the population, breed without creating offspring, and then lower the risk of avian malaria to native Hawaiian songbirds. So there's a lot of really interesting things coming out. I'm excited to see them. I am a little bit of the mind that we need this technology, but we also need it to be very well tested and understood. We're kind of in an age where anything that is not a synthetic chemical is being given a very quick green light without a lot of side guards on it. And then in 5 years, it's kind of like, oh, geez, we didn't think about that. So I'm all in favor of exploring new methods of pest control like RNA, but I think that we need to have a lot of testing done on it before it gets really widely deployed. So we are in favor of looking at it. We're not yet at a point where we're asking for more incentives for it. We'd really, at this point, rather see more of the approach that Wild Farm Alliance has taken, which is look at non-chemical ways of doing it, organic, regenerative, and then being able to partner with potentially new pesticide technology. So it's a weird world we live in, but it's a really exciting one. And what I love about it is we have the opportunity to make it better for birds with actions that we take every day. So really excited to be here. And thanks so much for all the great questions. And now my hard part is over. I get to drink my coffee and learn a lot from the others.
All right. Thank you so much, Hardy. Okay, I'm going to share my screen. Okay, so I'm talking about cover crop termination and bird safety. Joanne Baumgartner. I've been with Wild Farm Alliance for 25 years, and I'm in Aromas, California, which is along the coast. Um, I also was an organic farmer for a dozen years, and yeah, delighted to be able to share this information with you. So as we know, cover crops are really important to agriculture. They lead to having resilient crops because with cover crops, you build fertile soil that is can hold moisture. It's not compact, that it's biodiverse, so that those microbes can help with bringing in nitrogen and sharing water with plants, and a lot more stuff we don't even recognize. But cover crops are also important or can be important to birds. They support birds foraging, they give them shelter from the elements and protection from predators, and some birds nest in them, which is about the talk that you're going to hear. And birds, as Hardy said, can also help reduce pest, insects, and weeds. And we have been working in that field probably for, I don't know, 7 years now or so, and have lots of information. One of the take-home messages I like to share is that the overwhelming majority of songbirds eat insects while they're nesting. And you heard something similar to that from Hardy about how many birds eat insects. So in drought years, cover crops may have more nesting occurring. If you could imagine out in the wildlands, in droughts, especially in multi-year droughts, the cover isn't very good, as opposed to these tricolored blackbirds might be looking over the fence at a cover crop and thinking, that looks attractive for all the reasons I mentioned. So, a couple years ago, we were talking to a few growers who were concerned in this area was who had were thinking that there was birds potentially nesting in their cover crops, and they were getting ready to terminate them. This was in 2021 and 2022, which were light rain years at around 60% and 80% of normal. And So then the next year, it was a really heavy rain year. We got 150% of normal. We didn't know that when we started our survey, but we had that influence as we looked at 13 fields on 7 farms along the Central Coast. And what we did is we were just surveying what birds we saw when the crops were getting terminated. And these crops, sometimes they were mustered like this, sometimes they were a mix of things like bell beans, vetch, pea, mustard, wheat, oat, and phacelia. Um, so what we were looking for is birds' breeding behavior, and we found songbirds were singing and acting really territorial. Um, we also found that red-winged blackbirds, both the male, who they were showing their epithets, and females were carrying nesting material. And so those are all indications that they're getting ready to have raise their young and have nests there. We also saw other birds there. We found some of the birds were likely cover crop nesters because they nested on the ground, like savanna sparrow, common yellowthroat, tricolored blackbirds, black or dark-eyed junco, spotted towhee, killdeer mallards, and wild turkey. We saw mourning doves that nest on the ground, but sometimes they nest in trees. We also saw some brewer's blackbirds and American goldfinch, and they might nest in a cover crop. They're more of a shrub tree nester, but cover crops, as you saw, can be tall. We additionally saw other birds that were likely not cover crop nesters, but they were using the cover crop as a resource, probably for food. Tree swallows and barn swallows, European starlings, which are non-native pests, house finches, and a non-California breeder, the golden crown sparrow. So when the cover crop was getting tilled in or mowed, as in this case, a lot of times we'd see the birds were fleeing right at the last couple of seconds before the tractor got there. And that could have been an indication that they were feeding or preparing to nest. And then after the mowing, a lot of birds moved in because insects were exposed, and it was kind of a feeding frenzy, which was fun to see. Uh, so to put this in context, it takes about 34 days to build nests, incubate eggs, and fledge chicks for those ground nesting species. If any of those species, whether it's the songbird, the red-winged blackbirds, or maybe some of those other likely ground or nesters, were there, they would need those 34 days. And in the uh, that heavy rain year, it not only was a lot of rain, 150%, it was also very late rains. So into March, and then the fields had to dry out, and all the farmers were like, I can't wait to get in and get my cover crop down. So they weren't taking out their cover crops till the end of April or early May. If for some reason in another year, if that late rains made them take them out into late May, uh, there would likely be some problems. Those birds would have started nesting and then had their nests and kids destroyed. Um, but it's tricky because farmers they're often um, trying to compete in an industry that is really unforgiving. There's so many things they need to balance, and delaying the cover crop termination could create weed issues for them, which then is really expensive to deal with later. Or it could, if they delay their termination and planting of the next crop, then it could mess with their cash flow and financial health. So we recognize it's not a simple thing to just, oh, well, just leave the cover crop if you have to. Um, so then the next year, it was a normal rain year. A normal rain year in the Central Coast. I'm actually looking at a rain gauge in Watsonville, and that is about 23 inches in a normal year. In a normal year, the next year we looked at 7 other cover crop fields and found that they all were terminated a month earlier, which was really good because nesting really doesn't start until late, probably or mid-May. And so I mean, it depends. There could be some early nesters, but the earlier the termination, the better. It's always good to look at what you're thinking and analyzing with what others have looked at and done. And so there have been several studies looking at cover crops across the US and also hay fields that get mowed and may have nests in them. In Tennessee, uh, this study was done by Panos, who got her master's degree, spent many hours surveying throughout the winter and spring, and found that there were 70 bird species using the cover crops. And she found that termination was almost always early before most nesting began. And that was really a good thing. And she could urge that growers continue to do that because that meant that when the cover crop's gone, then the birds are like, oh, better find a place where they'll likely have success for nesting. In Illinois, these researchers found that eastern meadowlarks were supported by cover crops, some robins, some red-winged blackbirds, and the mid to late April termination which was typical there, was found to reduce nesting success. And so the researchers were saying, well, you should really delay your termination till early May. So you can see it depends on where you are in the country to know what that means for you and your birds nesting. As to exactly when, is it early May or mid-May or late May or but in any case, um, if you waited till then, they would foster nest success in early breeding birds and compensate for the negative effects of termination on later breeders. In South Dakota, there was waterfowl nesting in cover crops. This was blue-winged teal. You see here northern pintails and mallards, and the terminations significantly reduced nest survival. And the researchers were saying, well, maybe grazing the cover crop would be better, or just wait and terminate after all nesting fledging has finished. In Kansas and Iowa, they looked at ringneck pheasants and how cover crops were good when they were near wild areas where there was brooding habitat because the birds would go in and forage, use the cover crops, but they didn't nest in them, basically. There wasn't enough cover. And in other research, they've been links to vegetation height and nesting success, which relates back to the earlier discussion of how here in California in those drought years, when the wildlands didn't have a lot of vegetation, kind of made the birds want to move into cover crops. So in these 3 states, New York, Illinois, and Iowa, this is not cover crops. This is research looking at hay fields and pastures. And in New York, bobolinks had about a 30 to 45% mortality rate in hay fields because of mowing. In Illinois, only 13% of ringneck pheasants nests hatched after mowing, which if you think about it, like it's amazing that even 13% survived mowing, but in any case, not a whole lot. And then in Iowa, they didn't say how much, but it was significant reduction of grassland birds from mowing. So, how do we avoid ecological traps? Well, what are ecological traps? First, habitats. There are habitats that are perceived as good quality, but do not allow birds to successfully reproduce and persist. So, in the drought years, it makes cover crops more appealing. So, terminating early could reduce bird impacts. And heavy rain years with late spring precipitation may also make cover crops appealing. So terminating as early as possible would be great. If it occurred mid-May, if that termination, the nests would likely be destroyed. This is here in California, Central Coast. And it's not like you can predict, right? Every rain year changes, and now with climate change, it's even harder. So what can growers do? Well, planting cover crops early in the fall as possible allows for early termination in the spring, hopefully, if the weather permits. And the earlier the termination, the less likely there's going to be a conflict of nesting. And then even if whenever the cover crop is planted in the fall, just terminate it early. Don't let it grow to its full height and maturity if you think there could be a problem if it's moving into that nesting season. You could delay the uh, the termination past the time of nesting and fledging. Some growers have that ability. They can, depending on their marketing structure. Growers can also scout for nesting birds to determine if they will be impacted. And that's especially important if they're starting to get to that time when birds would solidly be nesting, like here, late May. You could also plant a winter cover crop, and so that's planted much later than the fall one, and that would mature then after the birds are finished with the cover crop. You might also lightly graze the cover crop, but you'd have to have attention to limiting nest disturbance. That's really reflecting on annual crops. For perennial crops, could either just delay the termination of cover crop till after fledgling, because there's a lot of crops that it does not matter. And they'll reseed, which is good because you wouldn't have to replant them. You could also terminate every other row before nesting begins, and then terminate the remaining rows once the nestlings have fledged. And we're going to come back to that evaluation. That is, yeah, my talk. And are there any questions? All right.
Joanne, there was one about what you mean by preparing to nest versus a bird who's actually nesting. Not understanding why they would be reluctant to leave if they were just planning on nesting there.
Why would they be if they're plant? Well, they're reluctant to leave because the tractor is coming, but but they have all these resources and they think it's a great place to be, and then all of a sudden, they have to leave. The there's lots of different breeding signals that birds put out. They'll like you saw, they sing like the song sparrow. they have flashy colors on their shoulders like the red-winged blackbirds. They're persistent in their songs. Some of them patrol the edges of their territories. Sometimes they chase intruders. Um, uh, and yeah, all of those things we were looking for when we were trying to decide if they were really preparing to nest or just there foraging for, in there in the cover crop for shelter. For tricolored blackbirds in the Central Valley, I'd encourage mid-late May termination. If it can't be terminated earlier, NRCS can often provide assistance for a producer when they delay nesting for nesting tricolored blackbirds. Yes, thank you, Jesse. Jesse is with NRCS, and that's good information for the Central Valley of California. And then also contact NRCS because they have a program all about tricolored blackbirds. And yeah, or would love to work with any growers who have those birds around. Apologies if you said it. What were the seed mixes in the cover crops? Are certain mixes better for nesting versus foraging? Well, I wish I knew the latter, but the mixes were bell beans, vetches, peas, wheat, oats, mustard, and phacelia. Um, let's see, here in the lower Fraser River Boundary Bay area of Southwest BC, it really depends on the crop. Much of the focus is on winter cover crops, typically going into September, early October, but tilling under in the spring really depends on the crop and the weather. Ideally, late winter, early spring, or early as the operator can get in to prepare the field. Generally, though, it's at the beginning of the nesting window, so hopefully a reduced impact, but still no means benign. Yeah, well, that's the story of humans, and like we heard with Hardy, it's not a simple answer to deal with pests. Sometimes we need pesticides, and we cover crops have so many great values to growers that we don't want to discourage them, and we recognize that they are not always benign. But yeah, thank you for sharing that. Um, we have a half an hour left, and I think what we're going to do is, unless I have more questions, I'm going to stop sharing and let our last speaker give her presentation. Yes, okay, here's Breanna Martinico.
Hi. Hi, everybody. So I'm going to be continuing on this great topic and focusing on the impacts of roads and also how habitat and other nest box attributes impact nest selection in birds. Choosing nest boxes on farms. And I'm Breanna Martinico. I work for the University of California Agriculture Natural Resources. I'm a cooperative extension advisor, and I focus on human and wildlife interactions. And a lot of what I work on is in agricultural areas, so promoting beneficial species, and also minimizing the impacts of pest species and kind of learning how we can manage and coexist with wildlife for better outcomes. Excuse me. Yeah, I'm really excited to be here today to talk about, let's see, advance my slides, to talk about, I'm briefly going to just review why we want to attract beneficial birds to our farms and how we can do that with nest boxes. And then I'm going to talk on two projects that are one, the Association of Nest Boxes and Nest Success with Roads. It's associated with the informational packet that was mentioned by Hardy and Joanne. And then I'm also going to talk about another project in progress looking at habitat and nest box features and and review altogether what that means for management and installations for nest boxes in agricultural areas. So this part is going to be a little bit of a review. Everyone's touched on it a little bit, but why do we want to attract birds to farms? And I like to use this angle that it uses both the animals perspective and also the human perspective. So animals and wildlife in our agricultural systems provide ecosystem services, and that can be really important for farm sustainability goals, reducing the use of pesticides and increasing working with the land to promote more robust agricultural systems, but it can also support, from a bird's lens, a conservation of their populations and help provide them with essential habitat for any of the stages that they may be present for throughout the year. And so below we just have some photos of some beneficial species that can be attracted with nest boxes or raptor perches. So barn owls, lots of diurnal hawks like red tails, American kestrels, and bluebirds, which I'll talk a little bit more about. But the main ecosystem services from songbirds nesting in nest boxes on farms is eating a lot of insect pests. And one study estimated that globally, birds eat 28 million tons of arthropods in croplands. And so there's been some other more local studies in California looking at how that influences pests and beneficial insects. And in vineyards, it's been shown that Western bluebirds can reduce pest insects, so insects that transmit diseases of grapevines, and that they also just overall can reduce arthropod abundance, and that they consume a variety of insect pests. So even things that aren't necessarily agricultural pests, but other things like mosquitoes that we want to have some sort of reduction of. And it's also important that when we're thinking about birds eating insects on farms, that we want to consider the net benefits. And so sometimes they could be eating beneficial species as well and influencing the food chain. So sometimes there's beneficial insects that also eat pest insects. And so thinking about how that impacts the overall food web within, in agricultural system. But overall, a lot of research is showing that the presence of birds is really having a positive effect. And while they may be eating some beneficial insects as well, that they're really having the most impact on our pest insects. And so this leads us to ask the question, how can we manage our nest box networks on agricultural properties to maximize the benefits from birds? And so both of these projects were really driven by wanting to create information management recommendations that were based on data. And so it's really important to have data behind these recommendations because people are spending money and time and effort. And so understanding how we can maximize the benefits and have the best possible outcomes, I think is really, really important information. Okay, so jumping into our first topic and the question about how do roads impact breeding success in birds. And so it's already largely known. A lot of research of birds and roads has been conducted all over the world. And the main concerns of roads having negative impacts on birds' breeding success comes around the reasons that roads can, first of all, they remove habitat and then they also fragment and degrade habitat. And these things can have negative effects for a variety of reasons, but overall, other factors also influence bird breeding success. So the presence of cars, so there's increased noise and light pollution. Increased predation can happen to birds nesting near roads because sometimes predators will use these roadway corridors as movement corridors. And then they're going to encounter birds nesting in that area and can have a negative impact on birds that way. And then, of course, vehicle collisions. Vehicle collisions is a really big factor for a lot of birds, and we know more about some birds, like larger birds like barn owls, than we do about smaller birds because it's a lot harder to collect data on that when birds are so small and less visible, but it has a huge impact on them. And so other other impacts of roads besides, mortality from vehicle collisions or things like that is just that they can have increased stress. It can cause reduced breeding output and then overall lower bird populations near roads or influence the types of species communities that could be present near or away from roads. And so for this project, we looked at a data set curated by the Cornell Lab of Ornithology, and they run a Nest Watch nest monitoring program where community scientists input data on nest boxes that they monitor across the country. And we filtered those nest locations by cropland. So in yellow, you'll see we've shown kind of where those nest boxes overlap with the agricultural landscapes in the U.S. And of that subset of these nest boxes monitored, we were able to pull 9,800 records, and that they occurred between the years of 2007 and 2020. And this is a multi-species analysis, so it represented 19 species across the US. So that included eastern and western bluebirds, chickadees, multiple species of swallows, barn owls, kestrels. So there's a variety of species of birds represented in this project. And then lastly, I just want to emphasize that. So we looked at how roads impact nest success, and we define nest success as a successful raising of at least one offspring from a nest. And so to kind of zoom in and look at how each nest was affected, we had to look at what species were using each nest box, and we estimated a home range size and applied this buffer around each nest box. And within that, we looked at the types and the miles of roads, and we calculated, how many miles of highways, how many miles of city streets, etc. And then we used that to analyze the relationship between nest success and the amount and types of roads within this home range buffer. And we were also wanting to control for things like interannual variation, like Joanne was mentioning. It can have a really big impact on whether or not birds are successful, and also species-specific responses. So we looked at everything kind of as a whole and wanted to kind of see if we could find any general trends. And so, and lastly, this is a home range example of kind of like what it would look like for like a nest box and the different roads within the buffer. And this is a buffer that was applied for a American kestrel nest box. And so some of the things that we did find were that nest success decreased with major roads. So those would be like single or multi-lane highways. They also decreased with the increase of local roads, so things like city streets or rural streets, and four-wheel drive trails. So these are things like meant for recreational off-road vehicle kind of recreational areas. So not farm roads, which we'll differentiate from in a little bit, especially with the management recommendations. But these roads had a negative impact. So when there were more of these types of roads within a home range, there was more likely to have decreased nest success. And then we also found that major roads had a stronger negative effect than local roads. And so that kind of could lend to the idea that faster speed limits, more traffic, heavier light and noise pollution have a more negative effect on bird breeding. And so with this data set and kind of with this analysis, we can't really say what exactly was the specific cause of lowered nest success in, in these areas with roads, but we can imagine that there's probably a variety of factors at play, kind of the things that I went over at the beginning, all the different negative impacts of roads. And so we can't really pinpoint what that is in each situation, but overall, there's a correlation with more roads and lower nest success. And so kind of jumping into other things that influence nest box use by songbirds. And so we wanted to understand if agricultural producers are putting out these nest boxes, can they select specific types of nest boxes, put them in particular habitats, or control for different factors that make them more successful? And I think the whole point of this is that keeping birds safe, I think selecting the right type of nest box and putting it in a safe area is, the number one factor that you want to think about in attracting birds to farms with nest boxes. And so, yeah, so we spent a lot of time looking at a lot of nest boxes, and we visited them to see what species were using the nest boxes. We measured different attributes of the nest boxes, and then we looked at local and landscape level habitat types. And so the main species, so this is done in Napa, California, and our main species that we found in our nest boxes were western bluebirds and tree swallows. And you can see here all the different kind of stages of the nests that we were able to observe, which was really, really fun. There were a few other species, so house finch, house sparrow, house wren, and violet green swallows, but predominantly 18% were tree swallow, 27% was bluebird, and then about 49 to 50% were unoccupied. So out of 995 nest boxes, over 50% or just about 50% were occupied. And this took place across 17 different vineyards across Napa Valley. And so when we measured the nest box attributes, we kind of just took a tape measure and we were measuring the dimensions of the nest box, the size of the opening. We used a compass to measure what orientation, so if it was facing north or northeast, south, for example, how high the nest box was mounted, whether or not it had a predator guard, and then if it was within or outside of a field. And then to look at the local habitat, we looked at within a 25-meter buffer of each nest box. We described the vegetation between the vineyards, whether it was present or kind of what it was. We measured the distance to the nearest perch, and if there was trees nearby, what the canopy cover was like, and then the different percents of different habitats. So there was a lot of these nest boxes were near fields, and so there was a lot of vineyard habitat, but around those fields can be grassland, oak savanna, it can be other crop types, and so we measured the percentage of each of those, and then we looked using a GIS analysis. We put a 200-meter buffer around each nest box, and then we looked at the type and amount of habitat within that buffer. And so that's kind of showing what that looked like here. Oops. And so we were able to create some analyses that looked at the associations with all those different things that we measured. And so some of the things that came out that were associated with nest box attributes, the really strong correlation with nest box use and predator guards. So these can be these over here on this bottom left photo, this is an entry hole extender, and that can prevent like a scrub jay or a crow from sticking its head in the nest box, or a raccoon from reaching its arm in, just because it makes a little bit more space between that nest area and what a predator can reach. Also, a freestanding post. So this was also had positive correlations with tree swallow breeding. And I think that also acts as a predator guard in itself, because it makes it harder for things to access the box. And then another type of predator guard that I forgot to mention is like a baffle underneath, kind of preventing things from crawling up the pole. And I think I have photos of that in a little bit. Orientation northness was associated with bluebird breeding, and I think that that is really an impact of, could be an impact of temperature. So it could have cause the temperatures in the nest box to stay a little bit more mitigated by the shade of the vines behind them, or not having direct sun kind of penetrating through that opening. So that was a really interesting. And then also located within rows. So bluebirds had a negative association with nest boxes located within rows. And I think that could just be the converse to, within rows, it's easier for predators to climb those vines and the vineyard trellising and access those nest boxes. So that could be something similar to that. When we looked at habitat, the overall trend that we found was that dense habitats for these two species were not preferred. They really preferred to be away from areas that had canopy cover within the local 25-meter buffer, away from riparian areas and woodlands. And tree swallows did select areas that were on farm roads, and probably because those areas are more open. And then within the larger land cover, 200-meter buffer, areas that had more forest had less use of their nest boxes by bluebirds and tree swallows, and then areas that had water had a higher incidence of tree swallows. And that's because they like to fly on the wing over these waters. They drink the water, and then they also are catching all sorts of aquatic insects as well. And so if you look over here on the right, you can kind of think, if you were to place nest boxes on kind of within this farm here, within this buffer, you might think of placing them out away from these edges that have woodland, away from this riparian area, and kind of sticking more to the centers of fields. Let's see. And a common question that we get is, will nest boxes attract to other bird pests? And so we did look at grape damage. We did a huge assessment, but we did not find that there were more wine grape damagers present in areas that had nest boxes compared to areas that did not have nest boxes. So while you are seeing more birds, like has been said earlier, we're getting birds that are eating insects and focusing on that and providing that beneficial ecosystem service. And you're not necessarily attracting birds that are going to be damaging crops or eating fruit. And so some things that come up for me and kind of like to discuss, like, oh, those were interesting, but why? Why were those associations there? So just kind of speculating a little bit on if past nest success impacts selection. So how did birds know, why did birds select nest boxes that had predator guards more? And one thing could be that with the predator guards, they had successful nests in those areas before, and so are more likely to come back in the future. And so do we know if what birds are thinking about, if do they recognize what a predator guard is, or do they feel more safe in those nest boxes, or have they just had successful nests and continue to come back? We're not sure, but it could be, any variety of those reasons. The same thing with facing north and having cooler temperatures in the nest box. That could also impact survival. Some of the later nests and that continue throughout the summer, they can have second clutches, and some birds just get started later. And those temperatures can get pretty hot and can be really, really detrimental to nestlings in those conditions. And so, um, because whether or not they know this nest box is facing north and it's going to stay cool, or if they just had a successful nest because it did stay cool. We aren't sure. And then another thing that has also been touched upon is how does the landscape impact prey availability, and does that impact nest selection? I think that for tree swallows, having that aquatic insect abundance higher could potentially, they might think of it as a higher, better quality habitat and select nest boxes in those areas. And then kind of back to that cover crop. We did find that bluebirds were associated with nest boxes that were in areas that had cover crops. And, I do think that, like others have said, that relates back to prey availability. And so, having those cover crops could just be signaling to bluebirds that this is a good habitat and that this is kind of where I want to select to have my nest. So what does that mean for management and putting in installing new nest boxes? And so the number one thing that I would recommend is to use predator guards, one or both or multiple types, and use a freestanding pole. Avoid roads and areas with dense roads or high roads with high speed limits or a lot of traffic. Um, and that farm roads are okay. So birds are not associated, don't have negative associations with farm roads. But there are probably some areas on a farm that have higher human activity or pumps or lights, and you can just choose to avoid those areas. But having nest boxes along farm roads can be very helpful in terms of management because it makes them easy to find and clean out and maintain, which is another important part of having nest boxes. Keeping nest boxes for if you're attracting tree swallows and bluebirds away from wooded areas. And so it's kind of like they can be in the vicinity, but maybe not right under wooded areas. Those nest boxes could attract other species, though, especially other things that will eat insects like wrens or oak titmice and other things that could still be beneficial. Orienting north to reduce temperature is really important. Having ground cover and or water nearby could boost populations. And also avoiding cats, pesticide use, and other things like compost pile, like placing them near compost piles where other predators might be attracted. And so if you already have nest boxes installed and you think, what can I do to, increase the success of those nest boxes? If you don't have predator guards, you can add predator guards. You can plant cover crops or increase native vegetation around your nest boxes. You can move them away from roads. And the best time to make any of these changes is during the non-breeding season. So once birds kind of set up shop, we don't want to disturb them and we want to give them the best chance at that season. And then next season we can move them and they can, hope that they have better outcomes. And so a lot of people have contributed to these projects. So I want to acknowledge them here on the right. And I want to thank everybody for listening and joining the webinar today. I will leave it to Joanne to let me know if we have any questions or time to answer them. But yeah, thank you, everybody. And yeah.
Yeah, well, thank you, Breanna. That was another fantastic presentation. There is a question. What are your thoughts on plastic nest boxes compared to wood?
Yeah, I think that there have been several instances where plastic nest boxes have been successfully deployed, and they could have other they could have really great features, especially if they're very, very insulated. That could be beneficial. But one study that I do know of looking at barn owls, done here in Napa, they did look at plastic versus wooden, and they did select wooden nest boxes more. And so I'm not sure why. I know they have different dimensions, and that could play a factor. But overall, I think that there's just pros and cons, and it's one of those things that's nuanced. Another benefit to plastic nest boxes is that they last longer because wood, obviously degrades. It's in the sun and the weather, and so if you aren't having success with plastic nest boxes, I do recommend trying wooden. I think that there's a little bit more likelihood that they would get taken up by birds. But again, if you have plastic nest boxes out that are successful, then that's great. I think you can go forward with that. Yeah, were
Great.
there any other questions? I know we're right at time, so.
I don't see any other questions. Yeah, maybe that's it. So thank you, Breanna. If you have any questions for Breanna that you think of later, she is with UC A&R, and she loves talking about this, at least with us, and I'm sure with growers too, or anybody else who's passionate about this topic.